Okay, so this is sort of a preview, introduction chat about the first part of book four. Book four is pretty formidable, and there's a lot of important things in it. So I break up book four for my students into two chunks. There's a larger chunk and a smaller chunk. So we'll do the first chunk now. So book four, have your Emily Wilson translation out, and as I tell my students in class when I do this. Particularly when you're getting used to Homer's language, and maybe if you're not familiar with reading ancient literature, difficult literature, to have little previews, have little moments to anchor yourself in before reading is actually really nice, really important. So chapter four, book four, in Emily Wilson's translation is called "What the Sea God Said." So what we would do is have a little review of the previous class. And what was strange about the visit to Nestor is Telemachus goes on a fact-finding mission, told him by Athena, go visit Nestor first to find out information about your father. And I asked my students to consider that he really doesn't get what he wants. He gets really no information about Odysseus. Nestor admits to knowing nothing. So something to consider is, what is the point of book three? What does Telemachus learn from the stories that Nestor tells him about Odysseus? So this is kind of a starting point to enter book four, as we just kind of go over book three and how this old sort of former fellow soldier with Odysseus helps Telemachus, because we're about to meet another one. So just really quickly, book four is a lot. So it includes the richest man in the world, the most beautiful woman in the world, expressions of post-traumatic stress disorder and profound loss, reliving the Trojan Horse drama, fact-finding with a shape-shifting sea god, and lastly, the plot to kill Telemachus. So if you are kind of 50% paying attention, you will get lost really easily. So I'll try to help outline things so you don't get lost, but really try to pay attention, bare minimum, to what's happening generally and who's talking. Sometimes we're sort of a story within a story, and it can get just really focus on chapter four. There's a lot of important information here. And I won't say that about every chapter. There's a lot of chapters that a lot of teachers don't even read, or they just summarize. This is one of the essential ones. So the opening lines tell of Menelaus. And it's important for us that if we haven't read the Iliad in class, to be mindful of who Menelaus is. So at this point, Athena and then later Nestor tells Telemachus to visit Menelaus. Menelaus's brother was King Agamemnon, the number one sort of leader of the Greek army that also involved Ajax, Achilles, Patroclus, Odysseus. So Menelaus was the brother of King Agamemnon. Menelaus's wife was the beautiful Helen, who gets abducted by the Trojans, that in effect starts the Trojan War. The Trojan War begins as a campaign to retrieve Helen back to the Greeks. Menelaus is also known as the richest man in the known world. So that's who Menelaus essentially is. In the opening lines of the poem, the first page and a half of book four, is the fact that when Telemachus and his ship lands in Sparta, where Menelaus lives, Menelaus is hosting, right in line three, hosting a wedding feast for many guests to celebrate his children's marriages. So always, in Emily Wilson's introduction, she really focuses on this, and I like to focus on it with my students as well, that if you're looking to simplify, which is almost impossible with this poem, but you can look at this entire epic as an epic of how strangers are treated. And I mentioned Emily Wilson says that the word for stranger in ancient Greek is also the same word for immigrant, which is interesting. So what we have here is a great example of hosting, right? Menelaus, although he's rich, is also okay with just taking care of people. So what we have early on is this opulent wedding feast. And Telemachus and his people sort of enter in to the middle of it, and they're welcomed. They're not asked who they are. They're bathed, they're fed. So all the sort of rules of hosting are mentioned. And I want to talk about the way they're welcomed. Menelaus, curiously, I don't have this in my slide here, but in line 62, it's page 154, says to Telemachus and Pisistratus, he says, "Your fathers must be scepter-bearing kings. The sons of peasants do not look like you." So that's always interesting. I'm mindful that Sherlock Holmes, this is a long ways away, but Sherlock Holmes can always tell, like, someone has the air or the walk or the movement of some, like a military man or a doctor, or he always can sort of ascertain that just by watching someone closely. So it's interesting that Menelaus can recognize sort of royalty in others, which he does. So go to line 88. It's on page 155. And to me, one of the most moving passages of the entire epic. Now, Menelaus, I think of, the high school yearbook that my high school puts out and all high schools put out, has a something you can include as one of the graduates. What is your ambition? And a disproportionate percentage of them, the ambition is sort of a material success, right? Wealth, being rich, make bank, however you want to say it. Menelaus is the Elon Musk, the Bill Gates, the Warren Buffett, the Jeffrey Bezos of ancient Greece. So on line 88, here's what he says on page 155. I just think this is really moving. "But while I wandered there accumulating wealth," he's talking about on his way home from the Trojan War. On his way home from the Trojan War, he's in Libya. He says, "While I wandered there accumulating wealth, someone crept in and killed my brother." So here's this Agamemnon Aegisthus story again. "His own scheming wife, Clytemnestra, betrayed him. I can take no joy in all in my wealth. Whoever they may be, your fathers have surely told you how much I have suffered. I lost my lovely home and was parted for many years from all my splendid riches. I wish I had stayed here with just a third of all the treasures I have now acquired. If those who died at Troy, so far away from Argive pastures, were alive and well." I stop there for a second. You figure his wife's right next to him as he's saying this. Why did he go fight? Why did he leave? To get his wife back. So in a way, he's saying that the deal he would make, because of the pain he's experiencing, is that he'd sacrifice his wife being with the Trojans. If he had to do it again, he'd give her away and not fight and not go through all that tragedy and loss. I can't help but to wonder what Helen's inner thoughts are at this point. But anyway, here comes the part that's really moving. "I sit here in my palace, mourning all who died and often weeping. Sometimes tears bring comfort to my heart, but not for long. Cold grief grows sickening. I miss them all, but one man most. When I remember him, I cannot eat or sleep, since no one labored like him, Odysseus." And remember, Telemachus is who he's telling this story to. "Please mark this line." This is one of the most beautiful lines in all of literature, in my view. Menelaus says of Odysseus, "His destiny was suffering, and mine, the endless pain of missing him." I actually wrote PTSD in the margins right next to that line. "We do not even know if he's still alive. He's been gone so long. His faithful wife and old Laertes must grieve for him, and young Telemachus, who was a newborn when he went away." Now, all of you reading this, we know this from reading plays. I would write in the margins, dramatic irony. Dramatic irony. It's a feeling you have when reading passages like this, and the feeling is that you know something that some of the characters in the story don't know, right? And the thing that Menelaus doesn't realize is he's actually talking to Telemachus. He's talking about the guy that he's discussing here. But anyway, I just find that such a heartbreaking, amazing moment. Telemachus predictably is, really emotional at this moment. And if you skip to line 138, This is on page 156, line 138. Helen interrupts the queen. Do we know who these men are, Menelaus, who've arrived here in our house? Again, that's not the question you're supposed to ask, but watch what she does. Shall I conceal my thoughts or speak? And then you notice it was a rhetorical question. She just keeps talking. Shall I conceal my thoughts or speak? I feel compelled to say the sight of them amazes me. I never saw two people so alike as this boy and Telemachus, the son of spirited Odysseus, the child he left behind, a little newborn baby. The day the Greeks marched off to Troy, their minds fixated on the war and violence. They made my face the cause that hounded them. Remember, it was Helen's beauty that in many ways led to the war, right? So Helen recognizes Telemachus first, which is really interesting. So go to line 219. I'm on page 159. And this is just a few lines, but it's the first example clearly of this idea that drugs/alcohol can numb pain, right? So Helen mixes a drug in their drink. And then 219 says, the child of Zeus, Helen, decided she would mix the wine with drugs to take all the rage and pain away, to bring forgetfulness of every evil. Whoever drinks this mixture from the bowl will shed no tears that day. So something to keep an eye on as we read, because it comes up later with the Lotus Eaters segment of the epic, is in this book, what is the point of feeling pain and loss? And does numbing it lead to good things? That's something worth just keeping an eye out. So Helen ends up telling a story starting on line 237. She tells an Odysseus story that is super interesting. I'm not going to read it sort of in detail here, but Odysseus and Helen interact during the Trojan War. And on line 256, this is on page 160, Odysseus is, as he often is, in disguise as a beggar. We see that later in the epic. And on line 256, Helen says, he told me all the things the Greeks were planning. I had underlined that. Is that a good idea? Is he intoxicated by her beauty and kind of loses his ability to make good choices for a second? Or is he doing this on purpose? So that part is really worth paying attention to. And we actually get moments starting on line 265, a play-by-play of what it was like being inside the Trojan horse itself. So go to line 316. And Menelaus finally gets to ask, Telemachus, gets to finally ask his question. Now, again, when I'm reading these lines out loud, put a little bracket near the lines, and I tell my students to write R.A., read aloud, whenever a teacher does that, because that's a good way to know at least what the teacher thinks is important. And then there's opportunities for students to annotate to note what they think is important. But in line 316, Telemachus says, finally, King Menelaus, son of Atreus, I came here in search of news about my father. My house is being eaten up. Our wealth is ruined. My home is full of men who mean me harm. My mother's loutish suitors. Each day they kill more sheep, more longhorn cattle. So I'm begging you here on my knees, tell me the dreadful news if he is dead. Now we get one of the weirdest, this is where I don't want you to get lost. It's one of the coolest but weirdest stories in the poem, and that's saying something considering that this is the poem I'm talking about. So Menelaus reacts to this. One of his really good friends is Odysseus, so the notion of suitors disrespecting Odysseus's wife and disrespecting his kingdom and his son really bothers Menelaus. So he ends up telling the story of Proteus, right? And Proteus is a shape-shifting sea god, the sea god that can become many different animals. And we still have this word protean, which is shape-shifting. So if something doesn't stay one shape or stay one thing, it's described of as protean, something that can change on a dime, right? So we get this unbelievable story told by Proteus, who Menelaus has to struggle to hold and to grab as Proteus goes through all of his the animals that he becomes. It's really kind of cool, actually. And Proteus tells this story. Proteus, of all the creatures in the universe, along with Poseidon, would know Odysseus's fate, because Proteus sort of commands all the animals of the sea and knows all the seagoing adventures. And the question, it's in the middle of page 167. So if you could go to 484, that would be good. Line 484. The question that Menelaus asks Proteus is, on line 484, "Come now, tell me this, and tell me truly, did all the Greeks sail safely home by ship?" So he gives a little set of stories about the different Greeks returning home. He retells, as if we weren't sure of it, the Agamemnon, Aegisthus story, and we get some new details. So again, when great writers repeat themselves, pay attention to the repetition, but also pay attention to new things. For example, we learned that Aegisthus killed Agamemnon over dinner, and there was all kinds of different elements of trickery there. So now go to line 553. This is on page 169. He basically, Menelaus, with not much time left, says to Proteus, the sea god, tell me news about Odysseus, even if the news is difficult. I want to hear it. And in 553, it says, Proteus answered, "It is Laertes' son." Now, if you are good with names, and remember, Laertes is Odysseus' father. And again, epic literature is a world where you're always somebody's son. That's a huge part of your identity that you can't escape. You may read Beowulf later on, and Beowulf is always Sunu Ejtheow, son of Ejtheow, except for one time at the end of that epic, which is a different conversation. But you're always somebody's son. You cannot escape your history. He answered, "It is Laertes' son, the Ithacan. I saw him," this is Proteus talking, "I saw Odysseus crying, shedding floods of tears upon Calypso's island in her chambers. She traps him there. He cannot go back home." So we get finally a kind of Google map detail. Like, we know that Calypso, we'll find out later, lives on the island of Ogygia, and we know what that is, right? So just really quickly, as page 170 and 171 conclude part one, I call it, of book 4, Menelaus begins the chapter with a feast, ends the chapter by giving Telemachus gifts. And so pay really close attention to really what stands out to you in this chapter. There's lots you can talk about and lots you can pay attention to and write about. But as I said earlier, it's a lot, So I'm going to go back to this crazy list. We do meet the richest man in the world, Menelaus. Think about what's surprising about him. However, what do you expect him to be like? What do you expect him to be happy about? But what's really going on? We meet the most beautiful woman in the world. But what's her story? What's her attitude? What story does she choose to tell? What is loss, particularly the loss of soldiers feel? What does that sound like in this epic so far? What was it like hearing, and maybe for the people there, reliving being in the belly of the Trojan horse? What was that like? What was it like hearing about what Proteus said about Odysseus? And then in the next class, we will discuss Telemachus's journey and the plot to kill him.